Hey everyone, welcome to First Look. Thank you for being here this time as we start to kind of move towards a new goal in this sermon series that we've been up to. So, if you've been kind of following along, you know that in the last few weeks we've been doing a series on Judas, trying to look at that from as many different perspectives as thoughtfully as we can. And so, of course, a lot of it has focused on him as a person. What kind of where was he at? What was he thinking? Why was he thinking this? The effect of evil in his life. His motivation, right? A lot of that internal kind of thinking through who this person is. Well, this week and next week we have two more sermons, but only one more class. So my class that I'm doing on Judas will end this week. So we'll have 4 sessions, but we'll have a 5th sermon. So we have this sermon coming up in the next one. And so this one, again, is our first attempt at looking at the what now of the effect. And I'm going to be using 2 different passages to do that. The preaching passage, the main passage, I guess you could say, is the text in John chapter 13 that talks about the actual Last Supper and when Jesus calls out Judas for being the one who will betray him. And but I'm also going to be using a second text, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. So this one, I'm just going to read really briefly. This is John 13, and I'm pretty sure it's like 21 to 30, okay? So this is all at the Last Supper. This is all at the Passover. And this is where we kind of see those last moments of relationship between Jesus and Judas, okay? So it starts in verse 21. After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, "Very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. Now one of the disciples, the one who Jesus loved, that's usually John, think of John, okay, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, John asked him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him, and then Jesus said to him, "Do quickly what you are going to do." Now no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the common purse, that Jesus was telling him to buy what he would need for the festival, or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. So you've probably read or had that passage read to you several times right around, the end of Lent into Easter, okay? I think there's some interesting elements of it that I wanted to talk about, and then I wanted to kind of let you know what angle I'm going to be talking about that, okay? So, first of all, if you notice, of course, even after Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him, he's still invited to the dinner. And they're all at the table, and Jesus announces that someone here is going to betray him. I think it's important that we take this, at least I take it at face value, when it says that everyone kind of looked around not knowing who this could be. And the reason I take that at face value is because I think it matters about the character or the persona that Judas had, right? If we take it at face value, that means that no one in the group suspected that if someone was going to betray Jesus, that it could be Judas. I think it's an important understanding, because Judas is someone who is, as the end of the text says, is responsible for the treasury. And evidently, they had no reason to think that Judas would ever do that. In fact, when Jesus says, the person I give this bread to, I mean, it says it right there. It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. So when he had dipped it in the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas. And after he received it, Satan entered him, and Jesus says, go and do what you're about to do. So Jesus says out loud, the person who I give this bread to is the person who's going to betray me. And he does it, not for dramatic effect, but I think to say, I am still in communion with you, right? Like, even though I know this is going to happen, I'm still giving you, you're still here with us. But once I have done so, don't delay. Go ahead and do what you're going to do. No one here is going to stop you. I'm not going to stop you. And even when he gives them the bread, people are still like, wait a minute, where's Judas going? Like, is maybe when he says, go and do your thing, he means give, do something good with the money that we've given you. It's still not registering that it could be Judas. Because think about that scene. You're in a situation where your leader says, someone here is going to betray me. And at no point does anyone seem terribly alarmed. John is reclining and they're all kind of wondering. They don't even know what that means, that he's going to betray them. And at no point do we see, or are we told, that anyone kind of whispers, I bet you it's Judas. Like, that doesn't happen. No one suspects anyone right off the bat. And then Jesus goes as far as to telegraph and say who is going to do it, and they're not alarmed by it. Like, okay, who I give this bread to is going to be the person who betrays me. And then he gives them the bread, and they're like, well, wait a minute, where's Judas going? To me, again, assuming I take that at face value, that means that didn't occur to any of them, which I guess could mean a couple of different things. Either Judas is a master of deception. I mean, the most masterful of deception you could possibly be, which I certainly suppose he could be. But to do that for 3 years is a long game. Okay, so it's impressive if that's true. Or I guess it could mean that all the disciples are not very bright, which I don't think that's true. Or it means that Judas was really genuinely trusted. That people really didn't think this could be him. They kept him in charge of the treasury. They assumed that when he left, he was going to go do something good. No one said, hey, go watch Judas, because who knows what he's going to do. That's not what happens. They assume that when he is hearing Jesus taking the bread and saying, go do your thing quickly, they mean something positive. And I have to think that means that Judas was a trusted member of that group, whether it was by some great deception or because he was. Either way, that makes what happens all the more traumatic. because they had put their trust in this person with the money, with their resources, with, like just being a part of the 12. And then he goes and betrays Jesus and then, of course, dies. That leads to Good Friday. That leads to Saturday, a day of mourning. But then, of course, all things are put right on Sunday. And I thought about that a lot. What all of that means for the church that was built. See, I try to think about things in terms of a modern context. Now, sometimes that probably works and sometimes it doesn't, but that's the only angle I have at anything. And I think far too often we don't spend enough time thinking about the effect that something has on the person that we're talking about. What was it like for Noah to live the rest of his life knowing what had happened to the world? That, the flood came and everyone was gone, and it was only he and his family that survived. What was that like to experience? What was it like for Samuel to choose David? To choose David, but before that, to be the one who was in charge of kind of shepherding Saul, only to have to go and anoint a new king while the king that he was shepherding was still alive, and to do all that. What was it like for Abraham to, lose Ishmael, for him to be sent out? We don't think enough about the psychological effect of the things that happen in front of people in the Bible, specifically. I think because of the distance. But I think the less we do that, the less real these people are. Because, of course, if someone came back from war, if someone you knew came back from war, or they lost someone violently, or something tragic happened to them, they were in a fire or in a flood, or the walls came tumbling down around them, literally or figuratively, you would assume in 2026 that person would need a lot of care and a lot of space and a lot of therapy and a lot of things, right? They would need a lot of resources. And we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about that when it comes to people in the Bible. And so my contention is that the disciples, between the resurrection and the ascension, and then the ascension and Pentecost, had a lot of time to think about what had happened. The fact that this man they trusted, Judas, had broken that trust, had ruined everything, at least seemed to, and then was gone with no retribution, no way of making anything better. He was just gone. And they are left being those to kind of pick things up. And so I think about that time they had, the forgiveness and the regrouping that went on after the resurrection to the ascension, and then that space of time where they're thinking, now what? Jesus still wants us to go make disciples of all nations. Still wants us to create this church. Still wants us to pursue this kingdom. But we're also existing in a world where our trusted person, someone we trusted with our finances and with our lives and with our goals, completely betrayed us. And now we're tasked with setting up the church, creating this model of the kingdom on earth. You could not convince me that the actions of Judas, given who he was in their community, in their group, did not have a lasting effect on them, spiritually, mentally, but also, as a source of learning. Well, we're not going to do that again. How do we create something where that can't happen again? Where one person can destroy everything for everybody, right? All it took was pulling one string and everything almost crumbled. And what does it mean about how we value community, how we value our resources? How is all that supposed to work? Well, the passage I told you there was another passage I'm pairing with this. The other passage that I'm pairing with it is looking at the first few chapters of Acts, specifically the places in Acts chapter 4 that talk about the kind of community that they built. Okay, so without breaking everything down that I think I'm going to break down in the sermon, take a look at that community. Take a look at the what they built, how they built it, what it felt like, and then think about that, right? Look at all of those pieces that you see, and how does the, we'll call it the Judas effect, play into that? The other, I think, element to that, not just the function of the early church, but also if you think about after that fact, like think about the early church from the moment of ascension to, say, when Paul becomes a major player in the church, okay? Because there's a period of time, of course, that Paul's not on the scene and then does eventually come on the scene. Paul was a singular visionary, right? He wanted to take what the disciples had built, take it, their teachings, the teachings of Jesus, the life of Jesus, and he wanted to expand it beyond. He was taking very, very seriously making disciples of all nations. Not that people had to come to him, but that he would go and reach them, right? But he was going to do it not completely on his own, but independent, as an extension of the church in Jerusalem, right? He wasn't asking Peter and John and James and all those to come with him. He was saying, I'm looking for the blessing of the church in Jerusalem to go out into the world, into these different places, and spread the good news without making those people into us, right? We're not going to try to convert them to Judaism specifically. They didn't grow up like we did. They don't speak our language. They don't have our customs. But our common, the Venn diagram is the commonality that we have is Christ. So I'm going to go and find ways that I can bring Christ to them instead of bringing them into our version of that. Because of course, the version of that James and John and Peter knew was, of course, had that Judaism slant. That's who they were. It was genuine to them. But if he was going to Rome, or if he was going into Greece, or if he was going into Turkey, the places he went, that wasn't going to be true. So the disciples were really apprehensive about that. Many of them, at least, were. James and Peter specifically, about letting that go. letting one independent person kind of take the gospel and go into other places. And my gut says that their apprehension around that had something to do with Judas, the traumatic response they still had. I haven't fleshed out exactly all of it yet. But when I look at the book of Acts, it is hard for me not to see a response to everything that they had been through laced in there. If we assume that the death of Jesus played a role in the church that was built, if we assume that the resurrection of Jesus, of course, played a role in the church they built, that the ascension, that the calling that they were given, right, the mission that they were given, all of that played a role. The betrayal of Judas would have to play some role, because, it's a relationship. It's personal. It was something personal that happened to them. It wasn't just a world event. This happened to them specifically, which is part of why I'm pairing it with this story of the Last Supper, because it's a very personal story. They're all sitting together. There's no one else in the room. There's just the disciples and Jesus. And they're sitting, and then somewhere along the line, Jesus just kind of blurts this out. And then Judas is gone, and they're like, what's happening right now? Like, they couldn't catch up. And so I'm really fascinated by that, because I think that we think about sin, we think about brokenness, we think about evil, and I talked a lot about that in this past sermon. But we also recognize that the brokenness around us, the sin around us, the traumatic elements around us also have an effect on how we live, what we decide. You're going to choose, many of us are going to choose a path based on where we've been. So, people become doctors because someone in their childhood was sick. People become therapists because something in their childhood that occurred. People become firefighters, or people, choose partners, choose spouses based on what they saw in life, what their parents were like, or what their siblings were like, or what someone else in their life, is for good or for ill. We choose paths based on where we have been, whether it's in our childhood or in our younger years, or what we've seen professionally, or whatever. People become a particular kind of grandparent because of the kind of parent they were, or the kind of parent they weren't, or the kind of grandparent they saw their parents be, or whatever. All of that factors in, all of that plays a role. And so we shouldn't ignore it when it comes to the role of Judas in the church. So I'm going to look at that. And hopefully that not only helps us kind of understand that a little bit differently, but it also allows you to kind of explore your own decisions. Maybe revisit your response to some traumatic things around you. See where that goes. Okay. So that will be that'll be the fourth sermon, and it'll also kind of cover the fourth class that I'm going to have on Thursday the 30th. Now, as I said, there's only one more class, but there's two more sermons. So the fifth sermon will kind of wrap everything up. It'll kind of it'll be my attempt to as kind of a final thought on how should we think about Judas. Who is this person in our story? And what does that mean for me? How do I see myself differently? That's where eventually we're going with the fifth one. Okay. All right, that's what I have for this week. Thank you for exploring that with me and thinking through that with me. I hope that we have you for class, and if not, I will do another review for that final class. Well, have a good one, and I guess I'll see you next time for another first look. So take care.